First of all, thank you both for doing this. I'm addressing the filmmaker and the camera sound recordist whom you can't see, but what a resource they've been creating over all these years. Before we begin, a couple of initial points, well, more than points, warnings really. First of all, you need to know with what kind of authority I speak. I don't only mean that while I appear before you talking about my work, as other films in the series have made clear, we each create versions of the work of countless others. I also want to underscore that in my case, my presence carries less a promise of accuracy than you might suppose. I was born with a shocking memory. Unlike my wonderful granddaughter, who can recall the month, if not the week and day when she did things, I can only conclude that my cognitive skills are elsewhere. So, for example, no effort of recall is going to sort out whether I read Evans-Pritchard's The Leurs before or after I read Radcliffe-Brown's Structure and Function. I can tell you that both made a huge impression on me in my late teens, confirming the kinds of interests I wanted to pursue. The story I tell myself is that I picked up Radcliffe-Brown at a bookshop in Charing Cross Road sometime in 1960, the date's in the book, well before I went up to Cambridge, as the phrase goes, in the autumn. As for the Leurs, it must have been a library copy, prompted by the list of recommended books for new students. Now, my teen years had turned me out as an ardent archaeologist, and my photo albums from the 1950s are filled with pictures of digs, including those on which I worked myself. On the basis of some high-flown thinking, we did the 18th century in school history and read a bit of Rousseau in translation, who fired me with all kinds of ideas about the nature of society, hence my purchase of Radcliffe-Brown. With all the pompousness of youth, I already knew that I didn't want to be an archaeologist. But the Leurs gave me a whole set of new reasons. I was enchanted by the description of Leurs cowbells. You must realise in archaeology that from a world of broken pottery and chips off tiles, because I grew up in what in Romano-British times had been the Roman countryside, here was all the vividness of a life being led, including people's aspirations and how they might sing to their cattle. But this is a story I tell myself, and much of what follows will be of that ilk. I cannot give you an unimpeded version of the past, since my memory doesn't allow that, nor even indeed of my ideas. Everything gets filtered through everything else, and of course changes over time. I shall check where I can with the evidence, but this is strictly how things seem to me in 2025. This leads to the second caveat. You also need to know that in thinking, writing, exposition, description, analysis, whatever, I often cannot help the inclination towards indirection. That is, I tend to approach things through other things, just as I am now telling you a bit about my early years in the form of a couple of warnings about what you might want to read from them. In fact, I think I have sympathy with what one might call the immanence of phenomena. Thus, my 17 and 18-year-old flights of fancy about the nature of society arose from an impatience with people's abstract appeals to society, in quotes. This was the era of a new kind of popular sociology, for example, William Hyde White's The Organisation Man, and the abstraction irritated me. My reaction was not Thatcher's "there's no such thing as society," but there is no one thing that is society. It is what, as present parlance would have it, a multiple, manifested in diverse ways. In today's words, rather than using society as a transcendental category, I wanted to draw out of it a multiplicity of phenomena. But obviously this is me speaking now. In fact, I didn't do transcendence, at least in its gross manifestations. Now, my parents did a very thorough educational job with me as their eldest. I had 2 younger brothers, and I was sent to Sunday school. My father was an atheist and my mother an agnostic, but they had both come from conventionally religious backgrounds themselves, and they thought I should learn the rudiments of Christianity. I subsequently took myself off to the local congregational church until the looming crisis of whether or not to be confirmed arose as a socially terrifying predicament, having to declare that I had never been baptized. My story is that I was saved by a set of radio lectures on astronomy, which presented a coherent, self-contained account of a universe, cosmologically speaking, that needed no deity at the wheel. It didn't just rescue me from an excruciating social dilemma in front of the church congregation. In thinking about it in retrospect, I suspect I was releasing myself from the authoritarianism of a transcendent being. One could be content with drawing interests out from the world as it was. That's my little reference to immanence. One consequence of my immanentist inclination, if I can call it that, is taken to a fault in exposition, where I tend to rely too much on presenting, say, ethnographic matters as self-evident, relying on it to speak for itself, that is, and on the reader's ability to see what I see in the material. In small doses, this can be an invitation to share, to participate. In excess, it can just obscure. More significantly, perhaps, it makes me averse to transcendent schemes. I like organising things, love institutions, in fact, but have no desire to gather everything up into singular, overarching frameworks. Indeed, I often share with people the fact that I do not see life, the future, as a road stretching out ahead. Please don't ask me where anthropology is going. There's a positive aspect to this, or I like to think. I have, or once had, quite good lateral vision. That is, quite a keen sense of what is already emerging, even if not completely visible. Not a vista ahead or behind, but on the periphery of vision, lurking in the foliage, so to speak. As social anthropology has moved over the last 60 years, I can point to distinct moments where I've picked up from everything that's going on around certain strands of thinking that I've articulated to myself, a kind of prescience, perhaps, and I shall mark these when we come to them. But just to add that it was a faculty that depended on my being a working academic with information and ideas and publications passing across the desk all the time, and I've now lost that position. Well, you already have a sense of my childhood. Born in 1941 in North Wales, where my mother had taken refuge, staying with my father's relatives from the danger of bombs over Manchester, where we lived. He was a journalist, a sub-editor on a national newspaper. She was a teacher of English, though gave up school teaching when they moved south. But she continued in that milieu. She became an examiner for one of the public examination boards, ran correspondence courses for seamen, taught in prisons, and held adult education classes. Anyway, after the war, down south in Kent, they found a house where at least one of the rooms still had its glass intact, in a suburb called Pettswood, on a fast railway line from London, significant for journalists as my father worked nights. The house came to be filled with, not music, but the music of words. Words were everywhere, bookshelves and bookshelves of them. We were allowed to read at table. I read as I got dressed in the mornings and on the train to school, even though the journey was only about 10 minutes. My father reviewed poetry for the Oxford Times. My mother lectured on women in literature or women in art to local WEA, that's Workers' Educational Association, or co-op classes. There was never any one view. Father took in 4 or 5 national dailies, that is, newspapers. In summertime, we 3 children played in the local National Trust woods, while mother brought with her examination scripts to mark. The secondary school I went to in Bromley took in scholarship as well as fee-paying girls, or I wouldn't have gone there. If at home my mother developed teaching courses about women in the arts and in the sciences, at school we had women teachers in subjects across the board and no gender division attached to what we learnt, as can be the case in mixed schools. It was simply assumed that I would try for university, and guided by some brilliant teaching, I sat for both the Oxford and Cambridge entrance exams as they were then. I got into Oxford to read history, as one of my sons was later to do, but being offered a place in Cambridge to read archaeology and anthropology made the choice obvious. I loved digging, loved the outdoors aspect of archaeology, using one's hands, but as you've heard, it was anthropology that I wanted to pursue. So as a farewell to archaeology, I took a special exam in it for the first year. That was 1960 to 61, and then focused entirely on social anthropology for years 2 and 3. Now, apart from moving from a combination of subjects to specialising in one, the 3 undergraduate years were structured in a compelling way. The subjects were not, of course, taught at school, so everyone was coming to them new. Anyway, in year 1, fresh from school, one was presented with a depth of material from archaeology, social anthropology, and physical anthropology that all felt like a huge leap forward. But then, in the second year, going into more depth in one of those streams, one realised how shallow one's first year knowledge had been. Not only that, things one had learnt in the first year were being criticised. Learning was in effect undone. Of course, the undoing only worked because of what had been instilled initially. Luckily, it was only the first and third year exam results that counted towards one's degree. Indeed, the second year was a time of experimentation on the part of lecturers too. Thus, Edmund Leach held a year-long seminar on the Trobriand Islands. After this year of assumptions being challenged, learning undone, we then moved on to a new level of comprehension in year 3 and to new specialisms. I took East Africa, for example, as my special paper. I should add that criticism did not go away, but one found a new confidence in dealing with it. Indeed, an enduring memory of undergraduate days is witnessing Leach in public argument with Maya Fortes. To encapsulate the issue, it was over the priority of dissent or alliance, insofar, that is, as they also involved kinship and economy. And the point being that they were arguing about which should take priority in one's explanations of the structuring of social life. One went from one lecture to another in awe of their passion. Heady times it was, more words. There was another source of independent view. A feature of teaching at Cambridge is the supervision system, very privileged. In addition to lectures given by departmental staff, students were taken for individual study in 1s or 2s with a supervisor who would oversee their reading and set them essays on it. In fact, more than one supervisor. One might go for a certain number of sessions to specialists in the topic that one was being examined on. Now, while supervisors had an eye to the exams, they also went their own ways and introduced perspectives of their own. Talk of words indeed. The essay writing was punishing and exhilarating. At least a 5 to 10 page handwritten essay a week, longer, typed in the third year, sometimes 3 essays over 2 weeks. But then those were the days that one could stay up all night and still cycle to lectures the following morning. My main supervisor in the generalist year was from my college, Girton, Doris Wheatley. But subsequently, she arranged for me to be supervised by colleagues in the two other women's colleges. In the second year, by the young Esther Goody, a West Africanist and her college was then called New Hall, and Audrey Richards, a venerable East Africanist at Newnham College. Esther became my PhD supervisor. My third year was a little unusual, in that I not only had a steady boyfriend from the year ahead of me, Emmanuel Strathern, but we were planning to marry and go to Papua New Guinea for fieldwork. Assuming too much has always been my downfall, but in this case I realised that I was correctly assuming that I would gain a place to do a PhD, brackets, goodness, exclamation mark. This was a time of university expansion, if you can believe it, and both my brothers went on to do PhDs. Martin in agricultural economics and Julian in forestry. In fact, at one point in the 1970s, all three of us siblings were in Papua New Guinea. The name of that Pacific island country had come into the house, and while we were away, my parents put a large map of Papua New Guinea over the fireplace. Back to 1963, the year I graduated, married, and set sail from Southampton on a migrant ship from Italy to Australia carrying 11,000 people. Now that's a figure in my mind, not one I've checked. Alongside my third year studies, I was writing letters to bodies that might help fund us. What was to be the Social Science Research Council was still coming into being. It didn't exist at that point, and we obtained funds where we could. I was also trying to keep abreast of the preparatory reading that Emmanuel Strathern was doing. We were startling our colleagues by tales of violence and antagonism that were being reported by the early anthropologists in the newly opened up, in quotes, Papua New Guinea highlands. Murray Ray, Richard Salisbury, the Burnts. How crass we were. In fact, Andrew had first thought of the Orokiva area, but the consequences of the eruption of Mount Lamington in 1951 seemingly put that out of the question. Mount Hagen was made interesting by the work of the Lutheran missionaries George Wiesdom and Herbert Tischner, who had set up a base there, more or less within months of the first government patrol entering the area in 1933. Wiesdom's successor, Hermann Strauss, actually brought out his magnum opus in 1962, although I think we did not have access to it until returning from the field. Much of Andrew's time was spent translating Wiesdom from German, which he mastered for the purpose. By contrast with myself, Andrew was an excellent linguist, having studied classics, in fact, before he switched to anthropology. Much of the time on the 5-week journey from Southampton to Sydney was spent struggling with language materials, both Pidgin, that is Neo-Melanesian, and the Hagen language, Medelpa, materials that Andrew made from the vocabularies given by Wiesdom. That we were heading for the Pacific was in part a reaction to the intense Africanist tenor of teaching in the department. There was a Melanesianist on the staff, Ray of Fortune, who had worked in Dobu near the Trobriand Islands, but his days were taken up with railing against Malinowski, who, he complained, had miscounted the number of wives married by the Trobriand paramount chief at Omarakana. If this sounds dismissive, I'm afraid I convey the general attitude towards him. We were on good personal terms, but he never made any sign that he wished to supervise us. Andrew was supervised for his PhD by the West Africanist Jack Goody, and I by Esther Goody. Esther couldn't have been a more sympathetic and stimulating supervisor. Hands-on when it was necessary, hands-off when it was not. But she devised a research topic that no doubt made sense in Ghana, but could not really be applied to the Western Highlands of Papua New Guinea. It was to do with the effect of sibling order, whether one was born first or second or whatever, and the effect of that order on success in life. And what I knew of contemporary Papua New Guinea suggested cash cropping as an arena. As I found when I got there, sibling order wasn't an issue at all among the relatively egalitarian Haganers, and cash cropping, principally coffee, had only just begun. Esther made no fuss at all about my devising a course of investigation on other issues. In any event, the university appointed an overseas supervisor with regional expertise, Paula Brown, who had worked in Chimbu on the border between the Western and Eastern Highlands and was based at that point at the Australian National University in Canberra. We broke the time we spent in Papua New Guinea from early 1964 to the end of 1965 with 5 months in Canberra, a period which was extraordinarily fruitful. Now, this is probably the point when I should stop talking in the plural about what Andrew and I did together. Several years of mutuality and cooperation were to lie ahead, including the publication of a joint volume, Self-Decoration in Mount Hagen. However, the vicissitudes of our relationship and the diverse places where we lived in Papua New Guinea, in Australia, in England, need not be rehearsed. We really did support each other in those early years, but thinking of those years now is not so easy. To put it otherwise, the disadvantage of a retrospect looking back from 2025 lies precisely in all the things that happened subsequently, and that remains a difficult filter through which to glimpse different kinds of times. So after the end of this episode, I shall not say anything further about what was, and this is an accurate figure, 21 years of married life. However, they had a lovely legacy. I've already mentioned my granddaughter. There are also each in his own way amazing 2 brilliant grandsons. As to my children, Barbara, Hugh and Alan, I simply couldn't manage life without them. That said, for my first spell of fieldwork, 1964 to 5, and then again for a short 4 months in 1967, I can reimagine life as it was before them, that is, before the children were born. Immediately on return from the field, I was offered an assistant curatorship in what was then the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. That was too good to be true, and I worked there on a 4-day-a-week basis, leaving 3 days to write up my PhD thesis, finally completed in 1968. And I shall talk about this topic next time. I was given leave in 1967 to return to Hagen for 2 months, and for another 2 months in a fresh location in the Southern Highlands, Wiru, where Andrew had been doing fieldwork for some time. This was in order to make a collection for the museum. The 1967 work was also devoted to systematic research on body art, which contributed to that joint volume, Self-Decoration in Mount Hagen. More than 30 years later, when I was able to invite 2 Haganers, Rue and Puglum, to Cambridge, several of the items in store were brought out to show the visitors. What struck Rue and Puglum was how new everything looked, fresh, as though given yesterday. For at home, the majority of string bags, bark belts, headdresses and so forth would have long rotted away. Citizens of a now independent state, and given these items were in store and not being up for sale, my Hagen visitors were, at that moment at least, seemingly content with the present location of these artifacts. But it seemed that Andrew and I were barely back in Cambridge when Andrew, then a fellow of Trinity College, spotted an opportunity for a further research fellowship at ANU. So we decamped and moved to Canberra, this time for a period of some 6 years, about half of which were actually spent living in Papua New Guinea's capital, Port Moresby. Now you'll recall what I said about the structuring of the syllabus at Cambridge, learning and then undoing the learning in order to relearn. This is one way in which I've come to think about some of the work I've done. And next time I shall talk about my first period of fieldwork in Hagen through the resultant monograph, Women in Between, whose undoing, so to speak, was the gender of the gift. Thank you.